The reply came faster than anyone expected. Within minutes of Tayara's message, the unknown sender responded with a set of coordinates. A point in deep space, far from any star system, far from any active battlefront. A place where no one would be watching. The message was brief and polite, written in that same flawless triple language format, and it ended with a name that meant nothing to anyone in the room. Captain Nathan Cole, United Earth Naval Command. The Allied command erupted into argument. Half the officers on the solemn accord were convinced it was a Shrokon trap. The insectoids were not known for subtlety, but desperate times made every species more creative. Others believed it was a hoax, some isolated colony with a broken transmitter and a cruel sense of humor. A few simply refused to discuss it, as though acknowledging the message would force them to confront something they were not ready to face. Tayara listened to all of them. Then she made her decision. "I am going," she said. Draylen tried to stop her. He argued that the ambassador was too valuable to risk on an unverified contact. He argued that the Allied fleet could not spare even a small escort. He argued that this was exactly the kind of desperation that got leaders killed. Tayara heard him out, and then she said, "Draylen, we are 90 rotations from extinction. If there is even a small chance that this is real, I will not be the one who ignored it." She took 4 warships, and Draylen himself, who refused to let her go alone. Pellic came too, clutching his portable communications equipment like a lifeline. They arrived at the coordinates and found nothing. Empty space. No ships on sensors. No energy signatures. Just the cold, silent dark between the stars. Tayara stood on the bridge of the Solemn Accord's escort, watching the empty void through the forward viewport, and for a terrible moment, she believed the skeptics had been right. It was a trick, a joke, a waste of time they could not afford. Then Pellic said very quietly, "Ambassador, something is happening." The void changed. 3 shapes appeared out of absolute nothingness, as if the darkness itself had decided to take solid form. One moment there was empty space. The next, 3 ships hung before them, close enough that the escort crews flinched at their stations. They were not large. By Valhari standards, they were almost small, compact, angular vessels with sharp lines and flat surfaces. There was nothing beautiful about them. No graceful curves, no decorative plating, no cultural markings. Every single centimeter of their hulls was functional. Weapon mounts, sensor clusters. Armor plating so thick it looked like the ships had been carved from solid metal. They looked like something that had been designed by a species that expected to be attacked the moment it left home. The lead ship broadcast a short identification signal. It called itself the Steadfast. Captain Nathan Cole requested permission to come aboard. Tayara granted it. She waited at the airlock, with Draylen and Pellic, surrounded by armed guards, her heart beating in a way it had not beaten in decades. The airlock cycled, the inner door opened, and Ambassador Tayara Vel saw a human being for the first time in her life. He was smaller than she expected, shorter than a Velhari by nearly a full head. His skin was a warm brown, his eyes dark and steady, his black hair cut very short and showing gray at the sides. He wore a plain dark uniform with no medals, no decorations, nothing to mark his rank except a small silver bar on his collar. He stood straight, but not stiffly. He moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned long ago to save his energy for the things that mattered. Behind him came 2 others. The first was a tall woman with pale skin and red hair pulled back in a tight knot. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Hannah Price, and she looked at the room the way a targeting computer looked at a battlefield, scanning, measuring, calculating. The second was a shorter woman with round glasses and a gentle face, Dr. Lena Marsh, a civilian advisor. She was smiling, and it was the most genuinely warm expression Tayara had seen in weeks. Cole stepped forward and extended his hand, palm open. Tayara stared at it. "It is a greeting custom," Dr. Marsh said softly from behind Cole. "You take his hand in yours and squeeze gently." Tayara reached out and clasped Cole's hand. She could feel old scars across his fingers and palm, the texture of skin that had been broken and healed many times. His grip was firm but controlled, strong enough to feel, careful enough not to threaten. "Ambassador Vel," Cole said. His voice was calm and low, with a steadiness to it that reminded Tayara of Draylen. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "Captain Cole," Tayara replied, "I hope you will forgive my directness. Until this morning, my people believed your species was a fairy tale." Something moved behind Cole's eyes. Not offense, something more like sadness. "We know," he said. "We have been listening to your stories about us for a very long time." They sat in the Solemn Accords conference room, Tayara on one side, Cole and his officers on the other, with Draylen and Pellick standing watch nearby. The guards had been dismissed at Cole's request. He said he wanted the conversation to be honest, and honest conversations did not happen at gunpoint. Cole explained everything simply and without drama. Humans had known about the galactic community for nearly 200 years. They had intercepted alien transmissions, decoded the major languages, mapped the political structures of every significant species. They had watched, quietly and patiently, from behind a stealth network so advanced that no probe or scan had ever penetrated it. They had watched the Velhari build their diplomatic empire. They had watched the Draenei train their warrior fleets. They had watched the Korath hide inside their nebulae. And they had watched the Shrokon grow, year after year, century after century, into the threat that now consumed the galaxy. "We debated what to do," Cole said. "For generations we debated. Some wanted to make contact immediately. Some wanted to wait forever. In the end, we agreed on a middle path. We would prepare ourselves, and we would act only when the need was great enough that we could not stay hidden any longer." He paused. "The need is great enough now." Tayara asked the question that burned in every mind in the room. "What can you offer us?" Cole did not exaggerate. He did not promise more than he had. He laid out the numbers plainly. 47 capital ships, 300 support vessels, 2 full marine divisions, ground soldiers trained to fight in conditions that would kill most galactic species. The room was silent. Draylen spoke first. 47 ships, he said. His voice was flat, carefully controlled, but Tayara could hear the disappointment underneath. "The Shrokon have thousands." "I know," Cole said. "Then what good are 47 ships?" Cole looked at Draylen for a long moment. Then he looked at Pellick, who was staring at him with those enormous black eyes. "I understand your doubt," Cole said quietly. "You are facing an enemy that outnumbers you in every way, and I have just told you that help has arrived, and it is very small. I cannot ask you to believe in something you have not seen." He leaned forward slightly. "So I will ask you something else. Give us one battle, one chance. Put us on your line and let us fight beside you. If we fail, you will have lost nothing that was not already lost. But if we do not fail, then you will know what 47 human ships can do." Tayara looked at Draylen. Draylen looked back at her. Neither of them spoke. It was Pellick, small and trembling and barely old enough to hold his rank, who broke the silence. "I believe him," Pellick said. Tayara turned back to Cole. His dark eyes were steady, patient, waiting. "One battle," she said. "Show us what you are." A small, precise movement. "We will," he said. The Shrokon were coming for Valon's drift, and everyone knew it. The drift was a massive supply junction, a cluster of stations and relay points that connected the Allied core worlds to their last remaining resource lines. If it fell, The core worlds would be cut off. No fuel, no ammunition, no food shipments. The war would end, not in a final battle, but in a slow, strangling death, as system after system ran dry and surrendered. The Shrokon knew this. Their fleet was already moving, nearly 5,000 warships, advancing in a formation so large that long-range sensors showed it as a single dark mass rather than individual vessels. 5,000 ships, each one bristling with weapons, crewed by soldiers who felt no fear and obeyed without question. The Allied fleet gathered everything it had, 600 warships. Many of them were damaged from earlier battles, patched together with whatever materials could be found. Their ammunition stores were low. Their commanders had watched 3 weeks of unbroken defeat, and were held together by duty more than hope. And somewhere among them, almost invisible, were 47 human ships. Cole had positioned the Steadfast and its companion vessels at the edge of the Allied formation. He had asked for nothing special. No protected position, no reserve role, just a place on the line. Tayara had granted it, and privately she had told Draylin that she did not expect the humans to survive the first hour. The Shrokon arrived at the predicted time. They were never late. Their fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel and spread across the space before Valon's drift, like a wall of black metal. Thousands of ships, arranged in the Shrokon's favored attack pattern, a massive grinding wave designed to push forward relentlessly, absorbing losses without slowing, crushing opposition through simple, overwhelming force. The Allied fleet formed a defensive crescent around the drift stations and waited. Tayara stood on the command deck of the Solemn Accord, watching the tactical display fill with red markers. Each marker was a Shrokon warship. There were so many that the display could not show them all individually. They blurred together into a solid red tide. Behind her, officers worked their stations in tight, controlled silence. Nobody spoke unless they had something to report. There was nothing to say. They all knew the numbers. All ships hold formation, Draylin ordered from his command chair. His voice was steady. It was the voice of a man who had accepted what was coming and was determined to face it with dignity. We hold as long as we can. The Shrokon wave advanced. It crossed the outer engagement range, then the middle range, then weapons range. The first volley was devastating. Thousands of Shrokon weapons fired simultaneously, filling space with beams of superheated plasma and clouds of guided missiles. The Allied crescent shuddered. Ships on the forward edge took hits that tore through their shields and peeled open their hulls. 2 Valhari cruisers broke apart in the first 30 seconds. Tayara gripped the railing beside the tactical display and watched the Allied fleet begin to die. Then she noticed something on the display. The 47 blue markers that represented the human ships were gone. She blinked. She looked again. Nothing. The positions where Cole's ships had been were empty. Where are the humans? She asked sharply. Pellic's hands flew across his console. His eyes were wide with confusion. I have lost them, Ambassador. All of them. They are not on any sensor band. They are simply gone. A cold feeling spread through Tayara's chest. They ran, she thought. They saw the numbers and they ran. The fairy tale species, faced with a real war, had vanished back into the myth they came from. For 10 minutes, nothing changed. The Shrokon advanced. The Allied fleet bled. Ship after ship was destroyed or crippled, the defensive crescent bending inward under the relentless pressure. Tayara watched it all with the numb clarity of someone who has accepted the end. Then Pellic screamed. It was not a word. It was a sound of pure, unfiltered shock. Every officer on the command deck turned to look at him. They are inside the formation, Pellic whispered. His voice was shaking. The humans, they are inside the Shrokon formation, right in the center, right next to the command carriers. Tayara looked at the tactical display. 47 blue markers had appeared from nowhere, deep in the heart of the enemy fleet. clustered around the 9 massive command carriers that served as the brains of the entire Shrakan armada. The human ships had somehow crossed the entire battlefield, passed through thousands of enemy vessels undetected, and positioned themselves at the one point where the Shrakan were most vulnerable. Tayara's breath stopped in her throat. "That is suicide," Draylen said. His voice was barely audible. "They are surrounded by thousands of ships. There is no escape from that position." For a moment, nothing happened. 47 small blue markers, floating in a sea of red. Then the blue markers began to move. What happened next would be studied in war academies across the galaxy for centuries. Military historians would slow the recordings down frame by frame and still struggle to understand how it was possible. Commanders who had fought battles their entire lives would watch the footage and say nothing, because there were no words for what the humans did at Valon's Drift. The 47 ships opened fire simultaneously, and the center of the Shrokan formation simply ceased to exist. Their weapons were unlike anything the allied species had seen. Kinetic lance batteries, weapons that fired solid projectiles at a fraction of the speed of light, punched through Shrokan armor as though it were made of cloth. Point defense systems created interlocking fields of fire so dense and so fast that missiles and fighters were destroyed before they could even begin their attack runs. The human ships did not sit still and trade blows. They moved constantly, weaving through the gaps between enemy vessels at speeds that should have torn them apart, each ship covering the others in a dance of coordinated destruction that was as precise as it was violent. They hit the command carriers first. One by one, the 9 massive ships that controlled the entire Shrokan fleet were torn apart. Explosions bloomed like flowers in the dark, white and blue and blinding. The human ships moved through the fire and debris without slowing, targeting the next carrier before the last one had finished dying. 9 command carriers, 11 minutes, all 9 destroyed. The Shrokan fleet shuddered. Without the command mines coordinating them, thousands of ships suddenly lost their central direction. Individual captains tried to reorganize, tried to form local command networks, but the humans were already gone, cloaked again, vanished into the dark, repositioning for the next strike. Then the fighter bays. Then the engine clusters of the largest dreadnoughts, crippling them in place, turning them into massive, helpless targets. Tayara watched the tactical display transform. The solid wall of red was breaking apart, fragmenting into confused, leaderless clusters. And through those clusters, like wolves through a scattered herd, the blue markers moved, appearing, striking, vanishing, appearing again somewhere else entirely. "All ships," Draylen said. His voice had changed. It was no longer the voice of a man preparing to die. It was the voice of a commander who had just been given a reason to fight. "All ships, advance, full attack, take them now." The Allied crescents surged forward. What followed was not a battle, it was a rout. The Shrokan, without coordination and under assault from within and without, collapsed. Ships fled in every direction. Nearly 1,000 were destroyed or disabled before the remnants of the armada managed to retreat into faster-than-light travel and disappear. The space around Valon's Drift fell silent. Tayara stood at the tactical display, her hands still gripping the railing, her whole body trembling. Around her, officers were cheering, crying, embracing each other. Pellic had his face in his hands and was making small, choked sounds that might have been laughter or sobs. On the display, the 47 blue markers reappeared, one by one, decloaking in a neat formation around the Steadfast. Tayara counted them. She counted them twice. 47. All 47. Not a single one lost. A communication signal appeared on Pellic's console, audio only. Captain Cole's calm, quiet voice filled the command deck. "Ambassador Vel, the drift is secure. Shall we discuss the next engagement?" Tayara closed her eyes. She took a long, slow breath. Then she opened her eyes and looked at Draylen. The old warrior was staring at the display. His 4 hands were clenched at his sides. His scarred face was unreadable. "What are they?" he whispered. Tayara turned back to the display, where 47 small blue markers held their formation in the wreckage of the greatest victory the Allied fleet had ever won. "They are real," she said. "That is all that matters." The victory at Phaelon's Drift saved the Alliance, but it did not end the war, not even close. The Shrokon Dominion was vast. Their empire stretched across hundreds of star systems, and their shipyards ran day and night, producing new warships at a speed that was difficult to comprehend. For every ship destroyed at the Drift, 3 more were being built somewhere deep in Shrokon-held territory. And the Hive commanders who led the Dominion were not fools. They did not repeat mistakes. They learned, they adapted, and they came back stronger. Within weeks of the battle, Shrokon engineers had developed new sensor arrays specifically designed to detect the gravitational distortions created by human stealth technology. The advantage that had allowed Cole's ships to appear inside enemy formations was fading. It was not gone. Human stealth was still far superior to anything else in the galaxy. But the element of total surprise was over. Cole lost his first ships at a skirmish near the Pellerin Nebula. 3 vessels, the light cruisers Resolute, Farthest Shore, and Quiet Dawn. They had been running a reconnaissance mission along the Shrokon border when a patrol fleet detected them and closed the trap before they could escape. 87 crew members. Cole knew every one of their names. Tayara was with him when the report came in. She watched his face as he read it. The calm did not break. His hands did not shake. His voice remained steady as he acknowledged the loss and ordered the remaining ships to withdraw to safe distance. But something changed behind his eyes. Something that had been carefully held in check moved forward. And for just a moment, Tayara saw what was underneath Nathan Cole's quiet composure. It was not anger exactly. It was something older and deeper than both. A weight that he carried always, and that had just become heavier. He excused himself from the bridge. He was gone for exactly 14 minutes. When he returned, he was the same as before. Calm, steady, ready to work. But Tayara had seen his eyes, and she did not forget. The Alliance itself was struggling, in ways that had nothing to do with the Shrokon. The Velhari Admiralty had spent 6,000 years as the dominant diplomatic power in the galaxy, and they did not enjoy being told what to do by a species they had considered imaginary less than a month ago. Senior admirals questioned Cole's tactics openly. They called his methods reckless, his fleet too small to matter, his species too unknown to trust. Behind closed doors, some whispered that the humans were simply another threat, that they had revealed themselves not out of kindness, but out of self-interest. They were warriors, and they respected strength, but they had their own ancient traditions of combat, codes of honor that stretched back millennia. Human tactics violated nearly all of them. The Draenei believed in meeting your enemy face to face, in strength against strength. The idea of hiding, striking from the shadows, and disappearing was deeply offensive to many of their officers. And the Korath, who had finally emerged from their fortress nebulae after hearing news of the Drift victory, trusted no one. They had survived for thousands of years by hiding, and they recognized in the humans a species that had done the same thing. But where the Korath saw their own caution as wisdom, they saw the humans' long silence as something more troubling. "You watched us suffer for centuries," their diplomats said. "You could have helped at any time. Why did you wait until now?" Tayara spent her days doing what she had always done, mediating, translating, smoothing the endless frictions between species that needed each other, but could not stop arguing long enough to realize it. But now she had an additional challenge. She had to make room in the Alliance for a species that everyone had a strong opinion about and nobody truly understood. She began spending more time with the humans, not just Cole, but his crew, his officers, the Marines stationed aboard Allied ships for joint operations. She wanted to understand them, not the myth, but the reality. What she found surprised her. They were not what the legends described. They were not savage berserkers. They were not mindless warriors fueled by rage and bloodlust. The human Marines she met were disciplined, professional, and strangely gentle. They learned alien names and pronounced them correctly. They shared their food with Allied crew members and seemed genuinely delighted when someone enjoyed it. They told jokes that did not always translate, but were delivered with such warmth that people laughed anyway. Dr. Lena Marsh, the civilian advisor, had essentially moved into the Solemn Accord's medical bay. She had brought cases of human pharmaceutical data and was working with Allied doctors to adapt human medicines for other species. In her first week, she developed a modified painkiller that worked on Draenei physiology and reduced recovery times by 40%. When the grateful Draenei medical staff tried to thank her formally, she seemed embarrassed and asked if they could just show her how their bone-setting equipment worked instead. Hannah Price, Cole's first officer, had begun training Allied pilots in human combat tactics. She was patient and thorough, but she demanded perfection, and the pilots who trained under her came back to their ships flying like different people. A young WarHFY pilot told Tayara that Price had spent 3 hours teaching him a single evasive maneuver, and that when he finally executed it correctly, she had smiled at him, and it had felt like being decorated by a general. They were kind. That was the thing that Tayara had not expected. Underneath the training and the discipline and the terrifying competence, the humans were fundamentally kind. But there was something else underneath that, something the myths had gotten right after all. Tayara saw it clearly for the first time during a strategy meeting aboard the Solemn Accord. A WarHFY admiral named Korath had proposed a plan to consolidate the defensive line by abandoning the outer colony world of Tessera. The planet held 12 million people, mostly WarHFY civilians, and a small Draenei garrison, but it was strategically exposed, difficult to defend, and holding it would stretch the fleet dangerously thin. The math was sound. Every officer in the room could see it. Abandoning Tessera would save more lives in the long run than defending it. Cole listened to the proposal in silence. When Korath finished, Cole looked down at the table for a long moment. Then he raised his head. "No," he said. Korath stiffened. "Captain, the analysis is clear. Holding Tessera costs more than it saves." "I understand the analysis," Cole said. His voice was quiet, perfectly calm, but something in the room changed. The air felt different. "We are not abandoning 12 million people. This is not about sentiment, Captain. This is about mathematics." "No," Cole said again. He did not raise his voice. He simply sat there, looking at Korath with those dark, steady eyes, and the word hung in the air like something solid. "We do not leave people behind. That is not a suggestion. That is not a preference. That is what we are." The room was silent for a very long time. They defended Tessera. The battle lasted 6 hours. It was brutal and costly. 4 human ships were destroyed, and over 100 Marines died on the ground, holding the evacuation corridors while civilian transports lifted off. Cole sat on the bridge of the Steadfast through all of it, coordinating the defense, adjusting the plan as conditions changed, never raising his voice, never losing control. When it was over, and the colony was safe, he attended every memorial service. He stood with the families of the dead, human and alien alike, and he spoke each name aloud, and his voice did not waver. Afterward, Price found Tayara on the observation deck. They stood side by side in silence for a while, watching the stars. The colony world they had saved glowed faintly in the distance, 12 million lives still burning. You think he is stubborn? Price said. I think he is carrying something very heavy, Tayara replied. Price was quiet. She stared out at the stars with an expression that Tayara could not quite read. Sadness and pride and exhaustion all mixed together. We know what it costs, Price said finally. Every one of us. We spent thousands of years fighting each other. We have seen what happens when you decide that some people are acceptable losses. We have seen what happens when you leave people behind. She paused. We promised ourselves that we would never let that happen again. Not to our own people. Not to anyone. Tayara looked at her. That is a very heavy promise to carry. Yes, Price said, it is. They stood together for a while longer. Two women from two different species, looking out at the same stars. And Tayara understood, for the first time, that the myths had been wrong, not because they exaggerated the humans, but because they had described only half of them. The stories told of strength and endurance, and a refusal to stop. But they left out the reason behind it. The thing that made humans not just fighters, but something more dangerous. They cared. Deeply, fiercely, painfully, and that, Tayara realized, was what made them terrifying. The war lasted 2 more years. They were long years, and they were hard. The Shrokon did not break easily. Every system had to be fought for, every border pushed back through blood and fire and patience. There were victories, and there were defeats, and there were long stretches where nothing seemed to change at all, where the front lines held steady and the only thing that grew was the list of the dead. But the Alliance held. That was the thing that mattered. Not any single battle, or any single weapon, or any single act of heroism, but the simple fact that 4 species, 5, counting the smaller civilizations that joined over the months, managed to hold together long enough to turn the tide. It should not have been possible. They were too different, too proud, too scarred by their own histories, but they did it. The Velhari contributed their logistical networks, vast ancient systems for moving supplies and information across hundreds of light years. They kept the fleet fed, fueled, and coordinated in ways that no other species could have managed. The Draenei brought their warrior traditions, thousands of years of tactical knowledge refined through countless wars, and their soldiers fought with a disciplined fury that the Shrokon learned to fear. The Korath, cautious and secretive to the end, opened their fortress nebulae for the first time in recorded history, and shared defensive technologies that no outsider had ever seen. Shield generators, sensor nets, and early warning systems that turned allied positions into nearly unbreakable strongholds. And the humans brought themselves. It was not just their weapons, or their stealth, or their strange, terrifying way of fighting. It was something harder to name. A stubbornness that went deeper than tactics. An ability to look at a situation that everyone else had already declared hopeless, and say, no, not yet, there is still something we can try. They adapted faster than any species the Allies had ever worked with. When the Shrokan countered one human tactic, the humans invented 3 more before the next engagement. When a plan failed, they did not waste time assigning blame. They fixed it and moved on. They fought like people who had been preparing for a war like this for their entire history. And in a way, they had. Cole became the quiet center of the Alliance. He did not seek the role. He did not enjoy it. But he was the one that everyone turned to when things went wrong, because he never panicked, never gave up, and never pretended that things were better than they were. He told the truth, even when the truth was painful, and he asked for nothing except that the people beside him keep fighting. Tayara worked beside him through all of it. She had become, without either of them ever saying it aloud, his diplomatic counterpart, the voice that translated his blunt human honesty into something the other species could accept. Together, they argued and planned and negotiated and compromised, and slowly, battle by battle, the red tide on the galactic map began to recede. The turning point came at Ashkara. Deep in Shrukan-held territory, buried inside a dense cluster of dead stars, was the Dominion's primary shipyard complex, a network of massive orbital stations that produced roughly a quarter of all Shrukan warships. Intelligence reports, gathered over months of dangerous reconnaissance, showed that the complex was heavily defended but not invulnerable. If the Alliance could destroy it, the Shrukan's ability to replace their losses would be crippled. The war would not end immediately, but the Dominion's slow, grinding advantage in numbers would be gone. It was the kind of target that could change everything. It was also deep behind enemy lines, surrounded by fortress systems, and defended by over 2,000 Shrokan warships. Cole argued for the strike. Draylen supported him. The Korath High Command hesitated, then agreed. Tayara cast the final vote. A combined fleet of over 2,000 allied and human ships made the jump into Shrokan space on what the Draenei later called the longest day. Cole commanded the human contingent from the Bridge of the Steadfast. Tayara had asked to be there. She had not explained why, and Cole had not asked. He simply nodded and made room for her beside the command console. The Shrokan were waiting. Not a trap exactly. The Dominion had known that the shipyard was a target, and they had reinforced it accordingly. But the Allied fleet had planned for heavy resistance, and they came prepared. The battle began at range and quickly turned savage. The Shrokan fought with the desperate intensity of a species defending something it could not afford to lose. Allied ships burned. Human ships burned. The space around the shipyard complex filled with debris and energy discharges and the silent, tumbling shapes of destroyed vessels. The Steadfast took a direct hit in the third hour. A Shrokan plasma lance struck the port side and collapsed an entire section of hull plating. 11 crew members died. The lights on the bridge flickered, alarms screamed, and for a moment the ship shuddered like a wounded animal. Cole did not leave the bridge. He did not even sit down. He stood at the command console, blood running from a cut on his forehead where he had been thrown against a railing, and he kept giving orders. His voice never changed. Tayara stood beside him through all of it. She was not a warrior. She had no training for this, but she stood there because it seemed important to stand there, and because she had learned from the humans that sometimes the most meaningful thing you could do was simply refuse to leave. The battle turned in the 7th hour. It was Hannah Price who made the decisive move. She had been commanding a wing of fast cruisers on the flank, waiting for the moment when the Shrokan defense shifted enough to create an opening. When it came, a brief window, no more than a few minutes, where the Shrokan line thinned around the main station's reactor complex. Price took it. Her wing punched through the gap at full speed, took fire from every direction, lost 2 ships on the way in, and delivered a volley of kinetic charges directly into the shipyard's primary reactor core. The explosion was visible from orbit. The reactor's destruction set off a chain reaction that spread through the station network. One by one, the massive orbital platforms broke apart, their frameworks twisting and collapsing in blooms of white fire. The Shrokan fleet, suddenly without the thing it had been fighting to protect, faltered. The Allied fleet pressed the advantage. By the end of the day, the Ashkara shipyard complex was gone, destroyed completely. Nothing left but expanding clouds of superheated debris. The Shrokan Dominion sued for peace 6 months later. Their command structure, already strained by years of unexpected resistance, fractured under the pressure of diminished production and mounting losses. Hive commanders turned on each other. Border systems declared independence. The monolithic empire that had nearly consumed the galaxy splintered into a dozen fragments, none of them strong enough to threaten anyone. The treaty was signed aboard the Solemn Accord. Tayara served as chief mediator, as she had been born to do. Representatives from every allied species were present, along with Shrokan envoys who moved stiffly through the diplomatic rituals, their compound eyes unreadable. Cole attended the signing ceremony. He stood at the back of the room in his plain dark uniform, his hands clasped behind his back, and he said nothing. When the treaty was signed, and the room erupted in quiet, exhausted celebration, he remained where he was, still and silent, watching. Tayara found him afterward on the observation deck, the same spot where she had stood with Price 2 years before. The stars burned cold and clean beyond the viewport, and for the first time in a very long time, none of them were on fire. They stood together in silence for a while. "You could have helped us sooner," Tayara said at last. It was not an accusation. It was a question she had been carrying for 2 years. Cole did not answer immediately. He stared out at the stars, and Tayara saw the weight on him. All of it, every battle, every name, every choice, pressing down on his shoulders like gravity. "We could have," he said finally. "We talked about it, for generations, but we were afraid." "Of the Shrokon? Of ourselves," he paused. "We knew what you thought of us, the stories, the monster tales, the species that fights for sport, that breathes poison, that bonds with predators. We were afraid that if we showed ourselves, we would become exactly what you feared. That we would look at the galaxy and see only enemies." He was quiet for a moment. "And we were afraid that we might be right too." Tayara considered this for a long time. "You were right about the stories," she said. "Everything the legends said about humans, the strength, the endurance, the refusal to stop, all of it was true. I have seen it with my own eyes." Cole's jaw tightened slightly, and he nodded once, waiting for the rest. "But the stories miss something," Tayara continued. "They described what you can do. They never described why you do it, and the why is the part that matters." She turned to face him. "You fight because you care, Nathan, more than any species I have ever met. That is what makes you frightening. Not your weapons, not your ships, the fact that you will tear yourselves apart before you let someone else suffer." Cole said nothing, but Tayara saw his eyes, and she saw what was in them, and she understood that for humans, silence could mean more than any words. In the years that followed, humanity stepped out of the shadows and into the galaxy. It was messy and difficult, and full of misunderstandings, as all great changes are. There was suspicion, and there was fear, and there were arguments that lasted for months. But the alliance held. New species joined. New treaties were written. The galaxy, scarred but alive, began to heal. The old stories about humans were still told, in Velhari academies, in Draenei training halls, in Korath archives deep inside their ancient nebulae. But the stories were told differently now. Not as ghost tales, not as warnings about monsters in the dark. They were told as history, as truth. Years later, Dr. Lena Marsh, who had gone on to build the first interspecies medical exchange program, and was widely considered the most beloved human in the galaxy, was giving a lecture at a Korath university. A young student raised his hand and asked her a question that students had been asking since the war ended. "What makes humans special?" Lena thought about it. She took off her glasses, cleaned them on her sleeve, a habit she had never broken, and put them back on. Then she smiled. "Nothing," she said. "That is the whole point. We are just people. We get scared. We get tired. We make terrible, awful mistakes that keep us awake at night. But when somebody needs help, we show up. When somebody is hurting, we stay. When everybody else says it is over, we say, not yet. That is all we have ever done. That is all we will ever do." The student was quiet for a moment, turning her words over in his mind. "That does not sound like nothing," he said. Lena's smile widened. It was the same warm, kind smile that had greeted Tayara on the day of first contact, aboard a ship called the Solemn Accord, at the beginning of something that nobody had believed was possible. "No," she said softly, I suppose it does not. For 6,000 years, the galaxy had told stories about humans. Every spacefaring species had heard some version of the tale. The WarHFY, tall and graceful beings with silver skin and 3 eyes, whispered about them in their diplomatic academies. The Draenei, a proud warrior race with 4 arms and deep blue scales, spoke of them in their war colleges. The Korath, ancient and cautious creatures who lived inside vast fortress nebulae, recorded the legends in their oldest archives. The stories all said the same things. Somewhere, in a forgotten corner of the galaxy, there was a small blue planet circling a very ordinary star. On that planet lived a species unlike anything else in the known universe. They breathed a corrosive gas called oxygen. They lived under a crushing gravity that would snap the bones of most other intelligent species. Their world was covered in predators, poisons, extreme temperatures, and natural disasters that could flatten entire cities. And yet, somehow, the humans had not only survived, they had thrived. The legends said humans were impossibly tough, that they could lose limbs and keep fighting, that they healed from injuries that would kill any other race, that they formed emotional bonds with everything around them, other species, animals, even machines, that they fought wars against each other for thousands of years, not because they were forced to, but because they could not stop themselves. But the most frightening part of the myth was the simplest. Every story, no matter which species told it, ended the same way. Humans do not give up. No matter what you do to them, no matter how badly you hurt them, they get back up. They keep coming. They never, ever stop. Of course, nobody actually believed any of this. Centuries of exploration had found no trace of the supposed human homeworld. Dozens of probes sent toward the region of space the myths described had never returned. Most scientists dismiss the legends as cultural artifacts, stories invented by ancient civilizations to frighten their children into obedience. The humans, they said, were simply the galaxy's oldest and most popular ghost story. Ambassador Tayara Vel had certainly never believed in them. She was a senior diplomat of the WarHFY Diplomatic Corps, a woman who had spent 40 years negotiating treaties, resolving border disputes, and managing the endless petty conflicts of galactic politics. She dealt in facts, not fairy tales. And the fact was that in 4 decades of traveling the galaxy, she had never seen a single piece of evidence that humans were real. She had more pressing concerns anyway. The Shrokon Dominion had been growing for 300 years. They were an insectoid species from the far edge of the galaxy. Billions of soldiers, organized into hive fleets, each one controlled by a command mind that could coordinate thousands of ships simultaneously. They were not creative, they were not subtle, but they were patient and they were relentless, and they had spent 3 centuries building an armada larger than anything the galaxy had ever seen. When the Shrokon finally attacked, they did not announce themselves. There was no declaration of war, no ultimatum, no warning. They simply struck. 17 WarHFY colony worlds fell in a single day. The Draenei home fleet, considered the finest fighting force in the galaxy, was shattered in a matter of hours. Across hundreds of light years, billions of people watched in horror as the Shrokon war machine rolled forward like a wave of black iron, crushing everything in its path. The Korath, true to their ancient nature, retreated. They sealed the entrances to their fortress nebulae and cut off all communication with the outside galaxy. They would ride out the storm alone, as they always had. The rest of the galaxy was not so fortunate. Within 3 weeks, the allied species had lost 1/3 of their territory. Their fleets were scattered and bleeding. Their supply lines were collapsing. Refugees flooded the core worlds in numbers too large to manage, and every day, the Shrokon advanced further. Tayara found herself standing in the command chamber of the Solemn Accord, the massive WarHFY flagship that now served as the headquarters of the hastily assembled Allied fleet. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of tactical displays. Every screen showed the same thing, a map of the galaxy painted in red. Red for Shrokon-held space, red for fallen colonies, red for destroyed fleets. There was very little that was not red. High Commander Draylen Orath of the Draenei stood beside her. He was enormous even by Draenei standards, his forearms thick with muscle, his blue scales scarred from decades of battle. But his eyes were hollow. The destruction of his home fleet had broken something in him that Tayara suspected would never fully heal. "We have perhaps 90 rotations," Draylen said quietly. His deep voice echoed in the empty chamber. 90 rotations before the Shrokan reach the core worlds. After that, there will be nothing left to defend. Tayara stared at the map. She had spent her entire career preventing wars. Now she was watching one consume everything she had ever worked to protect, and there was nothing she could do about it. "Then we need a miracle," she said. She did not believe in miracles, but she had nothing else left. The silence that followed was long and heavy. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound. Officers moved quietly at their stations, monitoring communications that brought nothing but bad news. It was Pelik who broke the silence. Pelik was young, even by Koroth standards. He was a signals officer, one of the few Koroth who had chosen not to retreat with his people. He was small and nervous, with wide black eyes that always seemed slightly too large for his face. He sat hunched over his communications console in the corner of the command chamber, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Ambassador," he said, "we are receiving a transmission." Tayara did not look up. Transmissions arrived constantly. Distress calls, casualty reports, requests for reinforcement that she could not provide. "Log it," she said. "Ambassador, I think you need to hear this one." Pelik's voice had changed. There was something in it that Tayara had never heard before. She turned to look at him. His wide black eyes were reflecting the glow of his screen, and his small hands were trembling. "It is unencrypted," he said, "broadcast on a frequency that no known species uses, and it is not coming from any allied system." Draylen stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the console. "Where is it coming from?" Pelik swallowed. He looked up at Tayara, then at Draylen, then back at his screen, as if he needed to read it one more time to be sure. "It says it is from a planet called Earth," he said. "It says they want to help." The command chamber went perfectly still. Tayara felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear exactly. Something deeper. Something older. The feeling of a world rearranging itself around a single impossible fact. She stared at Pelik's screen. The transmission glowed in 3 languages: perfect Velhari, perfect Draenei, and perfect Korath. Someone had learned to speak to all of them. Someone had been listening for a very long time. "That is not possible," Draylen said. But Tayara was already moving toward the console. Because in 40 years of diplomacy, she had learned one rule above all others. When you have nothing left, you do not get to decide what is possible. "Send a reply," she said. "Tell them we are listening."